So there's not like one theme to this conference, but if I had to pick one, it's probably data. Just every panel so far has talked about it a little bit. But Dave, I want to start with the Sounders match last night. Sounders are up 1-0. At the very last second, they give up. You guys give up that goal. So could a predictive analytics or data prevented that? Do you think?
In some way, yeah. In some ways, yes. I mean, I think where we're at with our staff with data is that when most people think analytics and they think data, they think very event-driven, right? And I think as we've evolved our staff and our way of seeing things, we want to use data more for the relationships between the players. Right, and if you look, yesterday was a good example. Okay, we had a lot of shots, we had a lot of passes, maybe more than the opponent, but yet the other team had some passes in difficult areas for us to close down. We couldn't finish our chances, and the relationships between the players weren't quite right at times. And you can quantify that, but most people aren't quantifying that.
So yes, or
yeah. I think yes, but you have to know how to use the data, and then you have to know how to use the data, apply that to the coaching, apply that to the training field, and change things there rather than change things in game.
So with data, the way I see it in sports is there's the collection of data. Once you got to get the information, there's the analysis of it, and then finally the kind of the digestion process, or how do you get that information to the fan or to the player. And we'll start with collection. Laila, you were saying that you were surprised at how manual the job is now in terms of Sportradar, which provides data for leagues, for companies like Facebook and Google. So in terms of actually collecting that data, how do you see technology kind of evolving that process, whether maybe with high-tech cameras or different gadgets? How do you see that kind of evolving with technology?
Yeah, to give you a bit background on that, so Sportradar is a leading provider of sports data around the globe. We are the official data provider of the NFL, of the NBA, NASCAR, NHL. What we are doing, we collect that data. We collect some data, we call it event data. We collect that more or less manually. We have some automated processes here as well in place, but it's still a lot of that work is manually done. We are always looking into new technologies in order to get that done in a different way, but it's working out so far. So we have 30 offices around the globe. We have 6,000 data journalists that collect that data, that event data from the venues or in-house. And what you have to distinguish is between this event data and then actually tracking data. So with tracking data, it works in a totally different way. Being also the official tracking data partner of these leagues, the leagues work with different companies that help them to collect that data. Taking the NFL as an example, so the NFL works with Zebra. They have that RFID chips in the shoulder pads of all the NFL players. This is information that we receive. We get it into our systems. So we are not collecting that data. That's captured by Zebra in that case. And we take that data and try to put it into interesting products for our media customers and bring that back to the market to see how you can really engage fans using that data, telling interesting stories. What's happening so far is that we are able to give you facts, like the player in a game, he runs so fast, but how fast is fast? So with this tracking data, you can really put numbers on that, you can put facts on that, and you can measure performance and things that are happening during the game in a totally new way.
Speaking of measuring performance, Dave, talk a little bit about how you've seen that evolve in terms of really measuring the data, because I think you guys have used Catapult, the GPS trackers, but looking at today and maybe to the future, do you see like that tracking of data changing at all?
Yeah, for sure. I think that you're always trying to contextualize your data better than You currently are, and we've started, I think this is our 6th year with Catapult GPS daily in training, paired with a heart rate system, capturing a ton of data during training sessions and kind of individual loads. However, when you put that, as was said here, you put a GPS unit on a guy and they run in a game and you get velocities, is it good, is it bad, and you need the context around that. So we're currently partnering with Metrica's optical tracking system in the stadium, where we can look at, again, our running versus the opponent's running. Our running versus our expected running. So an example is, as you saw yesterday, okay, they scored in the last minute, but what was the distance of our striker to our back line in the first minute versus the 90th minute? Was it bigger or was it smaller? GPS won't tell you that, but then an in-stadium optical tracking will. Were we able to close down opponents fast enough? GPS on an individual would not tell you that, but then an optical tracking solution, or at least some sort of tracking solution where you're tracking the data from both teams, would tell you that. So I think that, to me, that's the next step. And if you look at Zebra and what's going on in the NFL and the example of like a wide receiver, it's really nice if a wide receiver hits 23 miles per hour. That's really nice. But all that matters is that the wide receiver creates separation on the defensive back. That's all that matters. Because if he's running 23, but the defensive back's running 23, he's not open. And if you had tracking data from both teams, then you'd be able to see this receiver creates 3 to 4 yards separation per play rather than this receiver. And now that's a really different contextualized data that I don't think we're looking at right now.
So when will that day come when teams can basically share data with each other to enrich? You already have, like you mentioned, you have your own team's data, but when you add the opponent data, that can really provide a lot more context. Is that even coming? I've done a lot of stories on data analytics with teams, but a lot of them are very quiet because there's a competitive nature to this, right? They don't want to share their secrets. So that, in terms of getting opponent data, that just takes it to a new level. So Laila, I don't know if you can speak to this or the leagues. Who would operate that, and who would manage like the data distribution between different teams and organizations?
Yeah, we are in a really privileged position, I would say. We receive all that information already. We use it, of course, not in a way to measure performance or help coaches or players performing differently or making different decisions, but we have that data as a provider of the league. So we work with the league, we have that information, and we use that in order to create a story around the facts. So we are not using that in order to give one team an advantage on the market. So it's important for us to have that information, as it's really needed in order to tell the whole story about the game. What's really interesting now with the NFL, for example, is that moving forward for the upcoming season, they will have not only the X and Y coordinations of the players, but also the ball for the first time. So that's a really important element to us, because that's really needed in order to have the full understanding of the game. So I think tracking data is advancing over time, and it's really important to engage fans, to answer questions that a fan might have and that have not been answered so far. So we have a lot of data that's available, and now it's really about how to take that on the next stage, how to develop interesting, sticky products that the fan can consume and enjoy.
So we talk about opponent data, and then you add the ball tracking, which is, as you mentioned, already in the NFL. We're going to talk about Topgolf a little bit later, and that's all about RFIDs in the golf ball. So Dave, talk about ball tracking, and when you incorporate that information, how does that impact performance? Because you can tell different stories to the fan, but in terms of internally, is that really going to take it to the next level, or is it just a nice to have?
No, absolutely, and I think I'm lucky to be on a expert group with FIFA, with some members from the DFB, the German national team, and the Bundesliga. And right from the very first day, their attitude was, if you're only collecting data on your team and not the opponent and not the ball, it's kind of useless. And if they look at, I think, the last European Championship, they had the metric called packing, where basically tracking how many opponents were bypassed with each pass. So as the ball traveled and they were outplaying opponents the other team, and the teams that actually bypass more players per pass almost always won. So clearly it gives, again, I think we started this whole kind of data revolution within soccer with event data as well as then physical data. And I think the next layer is what's happening with the ball, what's happening technically, and really giving better context to every pass. And I think that's hugely important.
And so, Laila, if you have that data, what types of products is Sportradar going to make out of that? Because you mentioned earlier that Sportradar has kind of shifted from a data company to a product company now. So talk about, as one example of the ball tracking, but what kind of products would you come up with when you have that additional information?
Yeah, I can speak about an existing product already. So that's called Sportradar Radar 360. So that's a product, again, for the NFL. That's our longest partnership. So we signed last year up with an NBA, so there are some sticky products coming soon as well. But speaking about the NFL for now, in this Radar 360 product, that's basically a search engine that has historical data in it going back up to the foundation of the NFL, but also all the event data and also the tracking data now, including the ball when that's coming next season. What coaches and teams can do, they can access that information and they can search through that engine for interesting analytics. So they can kind of use it to measure their performance as well, to see if they're able to find some interesting patterns. This is something that we have currently in place for NFL, but we're going to extend this for multiple sports as well.
So who owns this data? Is it Sportradar in terms of what you were just talking about? And then when you have player data, is that the players? Is that the Sounders? Is that yours? Is that MLS? Like when you talk about ownership of data, and I feel like as you collect more data, this question is going to come up more, right? And we heard Sue Bird talking about this being used in like a trade scenario, right? So who owns this stuff?
I think it's important to separate between biometric data versus performance data. And I think that anything that involves biometric data is considered medical, which then the player owns. Essentially, everything else, all tracking data, is nothing more than location, essentially. So if I'm tracking someone's player location, I think that would be more team owned, but clearly the biometric data is considered medical and owned by the players.
I'm looking forward to the day when we can watch a football or whatever, and we could see Russell Wilson's heart rate, and then on the next possession you can see Tom Brady's heartbeat and see who's the more nervous player on the field. But when you talk about it being biometric and it's your own health and that's private, I would imagine maybe some media companies would want that and to show the viewer and to increase the value of that viewership experience, right? So would that day ever happen, you think, when we're watching a broadcast and we're going to be able to see all this different biometric data, or is it just going to be kept private?
Yeah, I understand, of course, that there are some sensitivities around that and that player might have not an interest or willing to share that, especially if that data is probably revealing something that they don't want to share with the public. But of course, from a data company's perspective and speaking about fan engagement, it would of course be interesting to have that data and kind of enable the sport fan to compare himself and his heart rate and things like that with the athlete that he looks up to. So that would be very interesting to have from a fan engagement perspective.
But is it even possible? Like, is that day ever going to come?
Collecting the data, having the technology to collect that.
Well, and then also showing it to the fan.
That's a players' union question. I think it'll be tough, to be fair, and yeah, it's always interesting with the discussions between the player union and the leagues, because I understand the privacy rights around biometric data. There's a fan engagement side. I mean, to me, it might be nice to see Russell Wilson versus any other quarterback's heart rate. I mean, that's not the questions I'm asking, so those aren't really important questions to me necessarily within that game, because I do think it's more about the tactical and strategic side of things. But yeah, it's definitely going to be possible. I mean, as the technology is advancing, where you have patches and a hub within a compression shirt that collects all this data, I know that one of the biggest issues is the battery life in terms of collecting all these things. So the technology is going to be there to actually collect it and then potentially visualize it. I just don't see a time in the near future where the players' union's okay with that, but you never know.
I think the question is also what, apart from fan engagement, what you can really do with the data in order to maybe protect players. So if you look into I mean, sports and technology is such an interesting spot. And if you look that more and more tech companies are going into the space and buying companies and really getting their foot into the sport business. An example, Intel, for example, they have that real-time injury prevention barometer. And if I can only imagine that would probably be run by such biometric data. But if they would have that in place and could use that in order to prevent injuries, that would actually something which could help the players, help the teams.
Dave, can you talk a little bit about when you have the data and then actually telling this information to a player or to a coach or to an owner? And I think that question kind of applies to not just sports, but all companies these days, in terms of you have this information, and then when you're trying to tell someone else what to do based on the information, what are those conversations like? As I would assume some coaches say, I don't care about data, I'm going with my gut. Or a player doesn't want to wear a device, he says, I feel fine. Or maybe the ownership group. And not just on the field, but also off the field, right? When you make trades and sign players and draft them, data is becoming more of that conversation. So what are those conversations like? And are you using any tactics to convince someone that they should believe in this information? Or tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think first, I think that especially within sports science, clearly the research says that subjective data collected in terms of wellness surveys or rate of perceived exertion scales, that's quite valid. Most of the people in this room love objective data, and so we tend to be biased towards objective data. But I think the first thing we have to realize when we are interacting with the athletes is that sometimes the subjective data you collect from athletes is just as valid, and in some cases, more valid than objective data you might be collecting with any sensors. So you need to approach the athlete valuing their subjective feedback and subjective data they're giving you. And then all of a sudden you have a little bit of an in. Second, I think organizationally you have to work really hard over time to create metrics that have meaning within your organization. And I think that's the hardest part. And I think what happens is, we've seen in multiple sports in the U.S. is kind of hiring of Australian sports scientists that are super smart guys, and they come in and they're given data to a head coach who's never seen data before, or this type of data. So he's naturally going to be very resistant to all of these new metrics that he's never seen before. So it takes time until you pick 2, 3, 4 metrics that clearly have meaning. And then 3, we've definitely moved in the last year or so more towards a real heuristics approach in terms of when it comes to explaining the analysis, we're going to try to create rules of thumb. We're going to try to utilize the data quickly and very agilely in terms of we come and we've got an hour, we're collecting stuff, we're getting some feedback to the coaches, and we use that data to support their decision rather than overrule their decisions.
Is this the balance of the art of coaching with sports science, right? And I feel like sports science is kind of moving more and growing and becoming more influential? Like, do you foresee a day when Coach Smetcher's looking at a screen behind him and making it, basing every single decision off all the data that's being collected on the players, or will that, that art of coaching, that gut feeling, will that always be there?
It's always there. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we should necessarily move to a place where it's all, again, objectively based, because I think, again, a sports scientist is not always going to understand the inherent error in what he's collecting and be very biased towards his data, just as much as the head coach is going to be biased towards his gut feel. But again, I think if you create this kind of heuristics process and create some rules of thumb, then they're more receptive to that kind of feeding. And we've gone the other way. We've gone trying to create some logistic regressions around injury risk and tell guys that, okay, this week this guy has a 15 to 20% chance of injury. And coaches, they just don't think that way. That doesn't resonate with them.
I think maybe I have one more question. And you mentioned prediction, and I think this applies to both of you. With you in terms of can you predict injury better with more data? And maybe for Laila, I know you guys, at least in Europe, you provide data to the bookmakers and maybe fantasy sports. So in terms of predictions, can you predict outcomes with more data? Where do you both see the idea of predicting, whether it's predicting an injury, maybe you're assessing a player and maybe you can see predictive analytics and how likely he's to be injured, or maybe what team will win and where am I going to bet my money, especially as Dave from Bleacher Report was talking about legal sports betting, that could have a huge impact. So where is that going in terms of the prediction engines?
Yeah, and in order to use that for the betting market, I personally don't see that being really the case. So Sportradar AG, based in Europe, is providing some services to bookmakers, and they have a lot of technology that kind of predicts the odds, and that's important in order to, of course, make sure that the bookmakers that they are not losing money. So that's our heritage for Sportradar U.S. somehow, in terms of that, because of that heritage, our data is really fast because it's important for bookmaking, and it's also accurate because otherwise they are losing money. So having that in place, that kind of philosophy and core aim to provide data fast and accurate, I think this element of really using now tracking data to predict the outcome of the game doesn't really matter for the business in Europe. For us here in the US, we are only a digital sports company, so we are really having nothing to do with betting at all. We are only focusing on media customers and media products. And from that angle, this information could help in order to not only tell the fan what's happening, which is really based on the facts, but also telling the fan why things happen and how things happen. And now with having that predictive element, we can even go a step further and tell the fan, what do you think will happen next? So that gives the fan a possibility to deeper engage with the sport, make a prediction about what's going to happen, or we could kind of from a visualization standpoint, give him a prediction on what could happen next, and then he could use that, put it on his Twitter account, on his social media platforms, and start a discussion about that. And you can, in that way, really engage fans deeper into the sport. The other part is, this is information, of course, that can be really helpful and interesting for fantasy sports, because they want to kind of predict what's happening. They want to use that information in order to determine which player they line up for, etc. So it's, of course, information that you can use in a lot of different ways.
And Dave, on the player side, predicting injuries, can you predict when Clint is going to get injured next, or another player?
I think that our time is far better spent trying to figure out the smallest amount of data we can collect to be the most predictive, because I think it's easy to try to kind of chase the tail of trying to collect more and more and more data. The reality is guys come in at 9:15 and 9:30, and you have 45 minutes to collect data off of them. And I think we are never going to have a pure predictive model because players' response to travel, home stress, sleep, diet, there's so much uncertainty there that we're better off really figuring out the 3 to 4 things that focus on to give us kind of a general sense of where guys are at.
Got a question?
Yeah, so Roger Brim with Bridge Athletic. Much of the technology in sports performance has been focused on the field performance, so the GPS tracking, et cetera. Can you talk a bit about how technology is being used in the weight room for athlete readiness and tracking their performance there as well?
Yeah, I mean, so currently we are using technology like Kitman Labs, some biomechanical assessment screens, Nordboard, measuring eccentric strength for hamstrings, and then as well as some jump mat platform type work to look at right versus left, contact time, power output. It helps us give us a sense of general athletic readiness and areas to work on within the weight room. I still find that the next level of everything is going to be on the field. And obviously we would love to, everything we're measuring, we'd love to be able to measure on the field rather than in the weight room, because we know if we can affect what's happening on the field, we get more transfer to performance in the stadium.
All right, I think we're just out of time. Dave and Laila, thank you for talking about the future of data.
Thank you.
Thank you.